Everyone thinks they've figured out Gen Z. Scroll through any comment section and you'll see it. Lazy, soft, addicted to their phones, can't handle real life. And look, maybe some of that feels true on the surface, but nobody's actually asking why. Nobody's looking at what happened to this generation and going, okay, what did they actually go through? Because here's the thing, there are real reasons, psychological reasons, and they're a lot more uncomfortable than too much screen time. Generation Z, born roughly between 1997 and 2012. They're the younger coworkers who seem distracted but somehow always deliver. The kids who look completely fine on the outside but are quietly running on empty. The people who can research anything in 10 seconds flat, but will spend 40 minutes psyching themselves up to make a phone call. And here's what nobody tells you. Their psychology is probably the most complicated of any generation alive right now. Picture this. It's 2010. You're 11 years old. Someone at school said something about you. Something embarrassing. And back when your parents were 11, that would have stayed in the hallway. Maybe 10 people would have heard it. By Friday, it's forgotten. But you're not your parents. You're 11 in 2010, and by the time you get home, it's already in a group chat, then a comment, then a screenshot, and now it's just everywhere. You can't escape it. You can't go home and leave it behind. It followed you through the front door, into your bedroom, under your blanket. That's not a small thing. That rewires how you see the world. A study in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology found that between 2009 and 2017, depression rates among teenagers jumped by 60%. Not slowly, sharply. Right as smartphones became normal. Right as social media stopped being optional. That's not a coincidence. That's cause and effect playing out in an entire generation's mental health. And what it created is something psychologists call contingent self-worth, which is just a complicated way of saying your sense of value stops coming from inside and starts coming from outside, from likes, from comments, from whether people approved of what you posted today. Gen X came home to an empty house and had to figure things out alone. Gen Z came home to a full phone, and in a strange way, the full phone was lonelier. Gen Z also grew up watching things fall apart, on camera, in real time. They were kids during 2008 when families lost everything. They were teenagers when a pandemic canceled what should have been some of the best years of their lives. First jobs, first relationships, graduation, all of it just gone or warped into something unrecognizable. Everyone kept telling them the world was getting better, progress is happening, things are improving, but their actual lived experience kept saying something different. So they stopped believing the speech, not because they're cynical, because they paid attention. Psychologists might call that disillusionment. Gen Z just calls it being awake. And that's why they talk about mental health in a way that makes older generations genuinely uncomfortable. They say things out loud that previous generations buried. Anxiety, burnout, depression, therapy, boundaries. Words that used to be whispered are now just part of how they talk. And people look at that and say they're weak, too fragile, too focused on their feelings. But here's what's actually happening. They grew up in a world where you couldn't hide anyway. Everyone could see everything. So pretending you were fine stopped working. It was too obvious and too exhausting. And research actually backs this up. Naming what you're feeling, actually putting a word to it, reduces its intensity in the brain. Gen Z didn't get softer. They just stopped carrying things in silence. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Despite all of this weight they carry, Gen Z has this relationship with information that nobody quite gives them credit for. People see them flicking through videos in 30 seconds and assume their brain is fried. Short attention span, can't focus, whatever. But that's not what's happening. Their brains learns to filter, fast, because they had to. They grew up being hit with more content in a single afternoon than someone in 1990 would encounter in an entire month. So the brain adapted. It learned to scan, decide, and move on in seconds. If something earns their attention, they'll go deep, really deep. But it has to earn it first. That's not laziness. That's a skill. A strange one, but a skill. There's this odd contradiction right at the core of who Gen Z is. They are the most connected generation in human history. More followers, more group chats, more ways to reach people than ever before. And yet, a 2023 Surgeon General report called Loneliness a Public Health Epidemic and identified Gen Z as the loneliest age group of all. Think about that for a second. The most connected generation is also the loneliest. Because a like is not a hug, a comment is not a real conversation, and they know that. They've always known that. But for a long time, it was all they had. So they built their social lives inside a system that looked like connection, but often felt hollow, and their brains quietly paid the price. And then there's work. This is the one that really gets people going. Gen Z sets boundaries. They leave jobs that don't respect their time. They talk about work-life balance like it's not even up for debate. And older generations look at that and see entitlement, spoiled kids who don't want to put in the hours. But look at what they actually saw growing up. They watched parents and older siblings grind for companies that handed them pink slips the moment numbers dipped. They graduated into a job market wrecked by a pandemic. They're dealing with housing costs their salaries were never designed to handle. They didn't decide work doesn't matter. They decided working yourself into the ground for a system that could drop you tomorrow isn't loyalty. It's just loss. They can't control whether the economy breaks again, but they can control whether their whole identity is wrapped up in a job title when it does. The American Psychological Association found that Gen Z reports the highest stress levels of any generation currently alive, higher than people who lived through recessions, higher than people who raised families before the internet existed. And most of them feel like nobody really gets what they're carrying. And that's probably the truest thing about Gen Z. They're carrying a lot, more than most people realize. They grew up in a world that moved faster than any generation before them was designed to handle. More information, more visibility, more pressure, more uncertainty. All of it, all at once from the time they were kids. They're not lazy. They're tired in a way that's hard to explain if you didn't live it. They're not soft. They just refuse to pretend that hard things aren't hard. They're not broken. They're just the first generation to grow up entirely inside a world that nobody had a map for. And somehow, most of them are still figuring it out. And maybe that's the realest thing about Gen Z. They know exactly how heavy things are. They say it out loud, and then they keep going anyway. If this one made you think, subscribe for more. And if you want to support what we're building here, hit that join button. Genuinely means a lot.